So first of all, welcome to the first lecture on the Kuzari. Today I'm going to give a biography of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, the author of this book. I'm going to talk a little bit about the significance of the book, why it's important, give you a little taste of what to expect. We may not actually open the book today, or maybe we'll just barely start. Now, just for starters, many of us have participated in the Mor Nevuchim class. Some have not. Regardless, this is a new book, so it's a new start, so it doesn't matter. However, there is a very good reason why I chose to study the Kuzari after we finished studying the Rambam and Mor Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed. And the reason why is because these are two great thinkers in Jewish history, both of whom were born and raised in the milieu of what we nowadays call the golden age of Jewry in Spain, during a time when there was much strife between the Christians and Muslims, especially in Spain or Andalusia, depending on which side you talk to. And it was a great amount of religious conflict, literally, armed conflict and fighting between the two, and also a lot of theological conflict between those two. And the Jews were caught in the middle, right? Now, the Rambam came out of that milieu and took one path of Jewish philosophy, which we just spent several years studying. The Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi took a different path of philosophy, and dealt with his position as a leader of Jewry in those times, and in a very different way. And both are extremely relevant and extremely important and extremely influential to this day. Now, before I describe a little bit more, the approach of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi versus the approach of the Rambam, I'm going to tell you that as we study together, those that have been with us for the Rambam might appreciate it a little more, but those that haven't will still be able to appreciate as we contrast some of the obvious differences in approach between the two of them. But now, before I do that, I'm going to tell you a little. Both books, the Rambam's Mor Nevuchim and the Kuzari, were originally written in Judeo-Arabic, which is a dialect of Arabic that was spoken by the Jews in most of North Africa and Spain in those days, right? And Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, I'm going to get to this a little bit later tonight, deliberately chose to write it in the spoken language because he wanted this to be a popular book, right? That is contrast number one between Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi's book and the Rambam's book, Mor Nevuchim. The Rambam specifically told us in the beginning that he's writing for those who have arrived at a specific state of perplexion. They've studied and they see contradictions between what they study in philosophy and science versus what they see in the Torah. How do you reconcile those conditions? And it was written for those elite that have achieved those level where they don't understand. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi deliberately chose to write it in this language because it was meant to be a book for the masses. Another contrast between those two books is the book Kuzari was actually very popular among the masses and remains so, especially in modern Israel today. But anyone interested in Jewish philosophy, the Kuzari remains a very, very, very popular book. And we're going to discuss that also a little bit more. But since it was written in Judeo-Arabic, it presents us with a slight problem of reading original text, which is what I always like to do. I don't like professing my own. I'm not here to give you my own ideas. I'm here to do my best to convey the original ideas of the thinkers that we're studying together. So I try to read the original, but I don't know or read Judeo-Arabic. So therefore, it was translated by the Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon, just like the Rambam, Mor Nevuchim, was translated by the Ibn Tibbon translator family. And it was translated, about 20, 30 years after Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi wrote the work in Arabic, was translated into Hebrew. That translation was what most Jews throughout medieval times used, although it was then translated in several other languages over the centuries. And the first English translation, I don't remember the person who named it. I think Jeffrey, I think you had a copy, was an American Jewish scholar in the early 20th century, somewhere in the 1920s, published an English translation directly from the Arabic. It's a good translation. The scholars have some issues with it, but it's an important one. And but it's kind of archaic English. It's 100 years old, and it kind of loses us, you know. So the modern English translation that I told people to buy is the Rabbi Daniel Korobkin one, which looks like this, but there's different printings of it. So you might have a different picture on your cover, but it's Rabbi Daniel Korobkin who wrote a recent translation. That's the one that I advise people to buy. It's a translation from the Hebrew. So remember, it's a translation of a translation. So, but I know that many of us our Hebrew skills aren't up to snuff. So I understand that I need a good English version. So I recommend, that's the one that I recommended. If you chose to find another English one, then go ahead and use it. I think the only other English one is the one that I referenced before. So I think that's the one to go with. What I'm going to use, there's several scholarly Hebrew translations available today that do go directly back to the original Arabic and translate it. One is Rav Kapach, who I was using when we did the Mor Nevuchim. I used his translation. Thank you for that, Yosef. The name, I assume that's the name of the translator. Am I right? Yeah, okay. I've been using this one by a person by the name of Michael Schwartz, who's an Israeli scholar who wrote in modern Hebrew, and based on what I've seen from all the Hebrew translations that are out now, because there's several, this is the most easily readable and it's just to me. So I'll be using that mostly as we read it. But because I translate into English, because if you don't know a single word of Hebrew, you'll still enjoy and learn something from this class. I'm not going to leave anyone out, regardless of your Hebrew skills. I'm just telling you that I'm using that text because I want to stay as close to the original as I can. But I'll also have Korobkin open in front of me so we can all discuss the ideas together. Okay, all that being said, that's the technical stuff. The next technical thing I need to say is that you may notice that right now I'm in the hospital. So I do have a patient in labor, but she has a long way to go. So I doubt it's going to get in the way of the class. But that's the reason for the very boring background, because I'm in a boardroom with a boring wall behind me. But anyway, so if I do get called in the middle, then I'll just let you know and we'll do what I got to do. So now let me talk to you a little bit about Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, a little bit about his life and who he was, and what kind of world he lived in, and what the purpose was in his writing this book. So first of all, Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, that's the author of the book we're going to be studying together. He was born in the city of Tudela, which is a city in central to northern Spain. In the year, there's some controversy over the year of his birth, but most scholars have settled on 1075. So we're looking at him being born in I guess that's the 11th century, right? In the year 1075. So for those that remember, we studied the Rambam together. The Rambam was born about 50 years after, right? So the Rambam was living after Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi flourished, okay? So 1075 in Tudela, he's born. We don't know a lot about his youth, but we can tell from his writings and his incredible, vast amount of knowledge that he had already accumulated by the time he was a teenager, that he must have had a very intense education, both in Judaism and Talmud, which he clearly was a master of, and also in Hebrew language, which I'm going to talk about in a lot more detail soon. And also in philosophy, he clearly was well versed in Neoplatonic philosophy and the kind of Aristotelian philosophy that those of us that studied the Rambam became pretty familiar with. He was very familiar with that. And he was also pretty well versed in the two religions that he was very heavily exposed to, which was Islam and Christianity, that were literally at war during his entire lifetime with each other, and he was caught up in the middle of that mess. Now, Tudela was under the control of the Christians at the time that he was born. So he was born in Christian Spain, but during that time, most of southern Spain was under the control of the Muslims. So in fact, most of Spain at the time was under Islamic control, but he lived and was born and started his life in Christian Spain. The It seems that he was very possibly a student in Talmud of the Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, who was known as the Rif, and was certainly familiar with the Ri Migash, who is another major Talmudic scholar of the time. The Ri Migash is also well known as one of the teachers of Maimonides, of the Rambam. So the Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi at some point was as either his secretary or something like that. So that was his connection to the Talmudic world, although he's not famous for that part of his scholarly background. But just to know that his Talmudic credentials were impeccable, even though he wasn't what he was famous for. So when he was living in Christian Spain at the time, Islamic Spain was being taken over by the Almoravids, right? The Almoravids, and if I'm not pronouncing it right, forgive me. Maybe Almoravid, I have no idea, whatever. But anyway, they were a very fanatical Islamic group that aggressively pushed Islam, and then there were many instances in where they aggressively pushed it and forced people to convert by the sword. So at the time, many of the Jews were running to northern Spain to get away from the Almoravids, to go under the Christians, because they had it slightly better under the Christians than they had it under the Muslims. This flipped around during history. There were many times in history where the Muslims were better than the Christians, many times when the Christians were better than the Muslims. But at this particular point in history, the Almoravids were pretty fanatical. Later on, a couple generations later, the Almohads came from northern Africa and took over from the Almoravids, and they were even more fanatical. And those were the ones that the Maimonides family fled, which we studied about when we learned about Maimonides. So here he was in that living in that time, and at some point, and he's studying and learning as a youth, and as a teenager, Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi at one point writes a poem, a letter, a beautiful poem, a letter to a famous paitan. A paitan is a word for a Hebrew poet who writes, poetry. Some of that could be secular, but we know them in history for a lot for their religious poetry. Some of that, whose name was Rabbi Moshe Ibn Ezra. Now, Ibn Ezra, that last name is very famous because there was another Ibn Ezra, which will be very prominent in tonight's discussion. His name is Avraham Ibn Ezra, who's known famous as the Ibn Ezra because of his Perush, his commentary on the Chumash, on the Torah, which is one of the most classical commentaries that many people study to this day. But right now I'm talking about Moshe Ibn Ezra, which some historians think he was a cousin. Some historians think he had no familial relationships, just happened to also descend from some guy named Ezra. But regardless, Moshe Ibn Ezra was a well-known paitan, a well-known poet. And Moshe Ibn Ezra lived in Granada, which was the southern part of Spain, under the Muslims, in a time when the leaders of Granada, the Islamic leaders of Granada, were very open to the Jews that were in their area, and it was Granada was a big center of Hebrew language poetry, and many of the things that songs that we sing to this day, are written by paitanim that lived in that time, which we'll save for another discussion if we ever have a lecture on the paitanim. But this was a very important time in history. So Moshe Ibn Ezra gets a letter from this young kid, really a teenager, Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, who wasn't yet Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, and he was so impressed by what he wrote and by the knowledge and his skill in Hebrew language that he wrote him back another letter. These letters, we have copies of these letters. Another letter, which was a poem in response to his poem, in which he invites Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi to come to Granada, right, so that he can enjoy the intellectual atmosphere in Granada, so that he can grow in his skills, and people can benefit from his incredible skills in his Hebrew language skills. So he does. Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi then moves to Granada and is now living under Islamic Spain. And there he starts to flourish, and he becomes a very, very well-known paitan. He becomes very well-known writer of poems. During this time, he was so good that he actually earned a living writing poems, right? So that people would hire him for parties, for dinners, not just Jews, Arabs, that or Muslims or whatever. They were invited him to come and write poems, which he was primarily writing in Hebrew. Some of these poems were of a religious nature. Many were not of a religious nature, of a secular nature. If you look up the poetry of Ibn Ezra, I'm sorry, of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, you'll see a lot of poems about love and passion and things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but and sometimes they were just poems extolling the host of whatever dinner it is that he has to go, saying about how great of a guy he is or whatever, who knows, whatever. But he made a living as a poet. But during this time, he became more and more and more famous as a poet. Now, and here he is growing in this environment, and it's hard to know the exact dates, but at some point, he comes in contact with the other person with the last name Ibn Ezra, who is Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra. Avraham Ibn Ezra is one of the major rabbinical figures of the time, and also a poet as well. And Ibn Ezra became more famous later in life for his commentary on the Torah. Now, there's some arguments as to exactly what happened, and you might see online different traditions. But what I'm telling you now is the latest scholarly research, mostly through documents found in the Cairo Geniza, right? That it seems that Rabbi Moshe Ibn Ezra was slightly older than Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, but they became very, very, very close friends. And Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra had a son named Yitzchak Ibn Ezra, right? His son Yitzchak married Yehuda HaLevi's daughter. Okay, so that's an important piece of information, and we're going to get back to that in a minute. So here now they have a familial attachment, and the two of them become very, very close friends. During this time, the Almohads come and take over from the Almoravids, and the Muslims become much more aggressive in promoting their faith. And Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi then has to run. So he runs to Christian northern Spain, right, to get away from what is becoming more a much more hostile environment for the Jews. There are documented cases where they would line people up in the streets, and it was either convert to Islam or death. So to escape that kind of persecution, they ran to the north. So here he is now living in northern Spain, where he gets into the circle of King Alfonso VI, who was the king of Castile, I guess. I don't know if I get the regions wrong of Spain, but he was a Christian king in this region, famous for many of his battles against the Muslims of the time. And he becomes close with several of the Jewish members of the king's court. The King Alfonso had several Jewish members, most famously his physician, who was a famous Jewish physician at the time, whose name was Yosef Ferruziel, and also another Ferruziel, a member of that family, his cousin, who was a diplomat. And he became close with them. And here he didn't have, there was no more interest in being a poet anymore. Nobody in this Christian Spain was interested in his poems, so he started making his living as a physician. And it's another similarity between him and the Rambam, is that he was very well versed in the medicine of the time, and he became a physician. So here he is working as a physician, and his good friends in the court Shlomo was once sent as a messenger, right, to a diplomatic mission for the King Alfonso somewhere. And on that mission, he was killed by a band of bandits, of I'll say Christian bandits. I guess they weren't very good Christians, I guess, if they were bandits, but they were, but Alfonso didn't seem to care much, and the Christians didn't really care about the blood of a Jew, even a high member of the king's court that was being sent on a diplomatic mission. And this really blew Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi away, because here he is running back and forth, and all he meets is persecution from every possible side. And this particular death of his close friend, who he thought had achieved a level as a member of the king's court, but he ends up just dying and just on the side of the road by some bandits, and nobody cares and nobody's concerned, he realized just how helpless the position of the Jews was within the big scheme of what was then the world that they lived in, and the empires that were fighting around them, and how they were just stuck literally between a rock and a hard place. So he wrote a poem then in which and this is where his intense, in his need to find uh, pride, to find hope, and that word hope is very important here, and to find some sense of solace and comfort, he dives deep into the heart of the Jewish religion, of who we are, what we stand for, and how we contrast with the people that are around us. And one of those things is that he sets his heart upon is the land of Israel. And the land of Israel is going to focus, and Jewish sovereignty in general, the idea of a Jewish king, and the idea of and the love and the attachment that we have to our land, and the special bond between all Jews around the world, and the special place that we play in the scheme of the world around us. And that became very intense. And in a poem that he wrote in response to the death of his friend Shlomo Perutziel, he writes something which, if you listen to very carefully, and if you don't mind me, before I even tell you what he writes, to go off on a tiny little tangent that's a slight pet peeve of mine, and that is that nowadays when you hear these very silly arguments that people have about Zionism and not Zionism, back and forth, most of the reason why I call them silly arguments is because usually neither party knows anything about history. But one of the things that you'll find is people trace most of the outside world that's not familiar with Jewish history, which is the vast majority of this planet, right? They don't understand our history. They look at Zionism, even when they try to learn it, they get a book, and the book starts with Theodor Herzl in the 1870s, 80s, whenever he started, right? But Zionism is much older and more ingrained in our people than that. And when you hear and read Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, you'll understand why he's so important for our development in our sense as a nation and the relationship to Israel and so on and so forth. But here he writes in response to this death, and he's writing now in Christian Spain after having been persecuted by Muslims and now living under the Christians. And by the way, Alfonso VI ended up becoming a persecutor of Jews himself, so there was no safety really even in Christian Spain. He says in Hebrew, Halanu nachala rak mikatche, right? Do we have any inheritance other than the holiness of our relationship with God, right? How is it that we have become forgotten by God's holy mountain? Hayesh lanu b'mizracho b'marav. Do we have a place in the east or in the west? Makom tikva, and that word should kind of ring in your brain. A place of hope, right? Nehi alav b'tuchem, a place upon which we can be secure. Now think about those words. That was just one stanza of a long thing where he was lamenting the place of Jewry in Spain of the day, right? And what he's looking for is a place where we can be secure, and he calls it a place of tikva, a place of hope. It's not at all coincidental that the modern anthem of modern Israel is called Hatikva, is called the hope, and it directly comes from the words of Yehuda HaLevi. I want you to understand the impact that he has. I'm sorry, I'm going to pause for a second. I just need to take a really quick call, so just give me a pause, okay? Sorry about that break. I don't have to run, but I needed to take that call. I'm sorry. So here he is writing that poem and just lamenting his place, the place of the Jewish people in the scheme of the world at the time, and how we do not have a place. Now, eventually he left Alfonso, he left the Christian lands, and he went back to the Islamic lands. And at this point is when he started really productively producing many of his works that we know him for, which are his religious poems that have made their way into the Jewish liturgy in a very intense way. We find many of the selichot that we say by the high holidays. Many of those poems were written by Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi. One of the most famous songs we sing on Shabbat at the Shabbat table, Yom Shabbason Ein Lishkoach, Yona Matzavo Manoach, the song about how the dove coming out of Noah's Ark found rest on the Sabbath day. It's one of the most popular songs there is on Shabbat. Was written by Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi. He was famous for writing the many of the keynote, the lamentations we say on Tisha B'Av. So most famous being Zion Halo Tishali, right? Regarding Zion. What do I ask for in Zion? Zion Halo Tishali L'Shlom Asirayich, for the peace of those who are your captured ones. Many of the poems in the keynote and the lamentations that lament the loss of Zion, the loss of Zion, and the loss of our relationship with Zion are all written by Yehuda HaLevi. And that incredible longing for Zion, that incredible longing also led him to write one of his most famous poems. It starts, Libi b'mizrach, my heart is in the east, v'ani b'sofa ma'arav, but I am here at the end of the west, which was, in his day, was Spain. And lamenting how he lives in comfort in Spain while the land of Israel is desolate. Now, so these are some of the things that he's famous for. So he goes and at this point writing mostly these kinds of poems that become extremely popular and deeply influence and give strength and encouragement to the people and reignite their sense of peoplehood despite the suffering that they're going through, and reignite their relationship to each other and to our ancestral homeland. That the love for our homeland. We do have a place. It might not be here in Spain. Here we might be bouncing back and forth and persecuted here and persecuted there, but we have a place, and that is our land in Israel. Now, so while this is happening, right? Remember, there's other philosophical winds blowing across the horizon. There's the Neoplatonism, which we talked about, the philosophy that was we learned a lot about it in the Rambam, the Aristotelian philosophy, and then there was movements in Judaism, such as the Karaites. We found later that in response to a Karaite philosopher, it sent a list of questions to Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, and Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi wrote him an answer to a list of his questions. We find out later that this was the kernel from which the book that we're about to study was born. We find this because a letter was found in the Cairo Geniza in which Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi writes this in a letter to someone. He writes down that he first had this idea when he wrote this response, and then he realized that this should be much more than a response, but it should turn into a book. Now, not long before the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, the people of Spain, the Jews of Spain, were exposed to what was to them a fantastic and incredibly wonderful idea, a thought, or something that it got a myth or a legend which does have basis in truth, and that is the conversion of the kingdom of the Chazars, right, of Chazaria, or the Kuzrim in Hebrew, the Kuzarim. Now, there is historic basis. Somewhere in the 7th century, there was a king, I think his name was Bulun, who was a king of the Khazaria, which is a land somewhere near the Black Sea somewhere. And they were kind of sandwiched. This is how most historians understand it. We don't know a lot, but to the extent that we found documentation and archaeological evidence, we know that there was a point where they were kind of sandwiched between the warring armies of the Christians on one side and the Muslims on the other side. And these kings it's a pretty powerful kingdom in their heyday. And they, for whatever reason, it seems from history that it was probably a group of nobles decided that they didn't want, if they weren't sure if we join this side, then we have a problem from that side. If we join that side or on this side. So they decided to take a third path and become Jewish, right? And the idea that there was a kingdom with a Jewish king, as you can imagine, in this kind of environment, was a huge notion, a huge idea. This is like, wow, like, so that Jews that are persecuted, that a king almost by definition meant either a Christian or a Muslim, and it meant either that today they'll persecute us, tomorrow they'll persecute us. But to have a Jewish king, that was like, wow. And there was some letters written by one of the kings of Khazaria, a king named Yosef of Khazar or something, who had written to Chasta ibn Shaprut, who preceded Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi by a generation or two. There was an actual correspondence between him, a Jewish leader in Spain, and this king of Khazaria. So they actually, they existed and they were talking to each other. They knew that they were around, but they didn't have a significant amount of contact. But this idea, as you can imagine, in this kind of environment, especially Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, who's trying so hard to give his people encouragement and lift their spirits and give them a sense of importance in a world where everybody's stepping on us, right? The fact that there's a Jewish king is a tremendous boost to the people's pride. You know, we can have our own country, we can have our own leadership. So it's not so what happened was, after he had written this book, he took like 15 years or so, according to his 20 years in his own according to his own writings, that to revamp this book that he had originally written in response to some questions. And he revamped it, and he wrote this book as if this was imagining the king of Khazaria when he was deciding to become someone, to change a religion. He wanted to adopt a religion, so he presented it as a debate. He presented a story, right? He never meant it to be a historical account, but it was using that historical event of the conversion of the king of Khazaria to present as if the king had invited a scholar, a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, and a philosopher, right? And listened to all four paths to find what path is the true path. And then in the end of the story, the Jew wins this debate and wins over the king's heart, and the king then therefore chooses Judaism because it's the right path, right? And if you imagine in the milieu and the world in which he's living, how important this is, because he's trying to show that if you take an honest approach and you look at all of the debates between A, B, C, and D, Judaism is going to win, right? And so he writes this book, and he originally gives it a title of what was the original title? Sefer HaHochacha V'Haraya L'Haganat HaDat HaMushpelet, which roughly translates to a book of proofs in defense of the despised faith, right? In other words, I'm writing a book in defense of Judaism, which is the despised faith. He publishes this book. And at the end of the book, and one day all of you will get to the end of this book, he writes about his relationship to the land of Israel. And the king asks him a question. When I say him, it's the one who, in this imagined book, right, in this imagined debate, is the chaver, is the Jewish scholar. He asks the Jewish scholar, if you have such a wonderful relationship with Israel, why are you here? And he says, you're right. And I go to Israel, right? So after publishing this book, which ends in that very dramatic fashion, Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi decides to go to Israel. So we now know from various sources, and mostly from the Cairo Geniza, from letters that have been found, that what happened in the summer of 1140, right? So here we are. He is now 65 approximately years old. That Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi leaves Spain, and he gets on a boat to go across the Mediterranean towards the Holy Land, right? It's a very difficult trip. We have letters from him describing how he was seasick and how they got stopped by pirates and how all kinds of craziness happened on the trip. But he eventually gets to Alexandria, Egypt, right? When he gets to Alexandria, Egypt, we also know from the Cairo Geniza that he was treated like a hero. It turns out this was actually his second attempt. In 1130, I didn't mention, he did start out to the Holy Land, but he turned around and went back to Spain. But now it's 10 years later, he's back in Egypt. He gets welcomed like a hero. The people of Egypt are begging him to stay. They're telling him, you're crazy for going to the Holy Land. Well, how could you go? At this time, it's under the Crusader kingdom. It's Christian run. under the Crusader kingdom is at the height of its power, and there really is no place for Jews in Israel at the time. There are a few, but very, very few. No significant Jewish community in Israel. There's a few here, a few there, a couple in Akko, a couple in Jerusalem, a couple in Gaza, a couple here scattered here and there, but not much at all. And it's dangerous and it's impoverished, and the Christians are ruling with an iron fist. So he ends up staying in Alexandria for a few months, and then eventually he goes to Cairo, where he stays for like 5 months. And during this time, he tries to work out arrangements, and we have documentation of him trying to work out arrangements to take a caravan across the Sinai to go to Israel. In the end, that route turned out to be too dangerous, too expensive, too long, and not practical. So he ends up getting on a ship. And because of the letters that we know and documentation that have been found, this is pretty cool. On May 8th, 1141, we know the exact date that he boarded a ship in the port of Alexandria bound for Akko, which is the city in the Holy Land of Port in northern Israel, right? Now, here's where it gets, we're pretty sure that he was accompanied by his son-in-law, right? With the intent that his son-in-law was going to bring his daughter. And he also had a grandson whose name was Yehuda ibn Ezra, right? That would have been the Ibn Ezra's grandson and Yehuda HaLevi's grandson, because he had written letters to this Yehuda ibn Ezra. But on the boat, we're pretty sure it was just Yitzchak ibn Ezra and his father-in-law, Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi. So then after this, there's a lot of discussion among the scholars what happened, because all we know is that several months later, we know that there was a letter written that was found in Cairo declaring, that, speaking about Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi as he was deceased, that he was dead, that he was no longer with us. So did he reach the land of Israel, or did he not reach the land of Israel? So I can go through a debate that's been ongoing among scholars on and on and on. But I'm going to tell you what the general consensus of the modern scholars is, and I'm going to tell you that there is a tradition among the Jewish people, which was first mentioned clearly in a book in the 1500s. So this is several hundred years later, that Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi reached the gates of Jerusalem and reached the Kotel, the Western Wall, and that upon reaching the Temple Mount, he tore his clothes and composed the famous, or at least read his famous poem Tzion Halo Tisha Li, right, which we read on Tisha B'Av, right? All of us, if you bothered to say the keynote, then you read it on Tisha B'Av, right? And while he was crying and kneeling on the ground with his clothing torn, an Arab horseman rode and was incensed about how he was getting all spiritual at the Temple Mount. He took out a sword and stabbed him and killed him on the spot. That was a legend that was first written in the 1500s. This legend has been repeated over and over again for years, but it's been disputed. First of all, why would there have been an Arab in Jerusalem if the Christians were in control of Jerusalem? So that part of the story doesn't make sense, right? Or it doesn't seem to make sense, at least. And if he was an Arab in Jerusalem, well, he wouldn't have been so brazen as to pull out his sword right in front of the palace, which is the king, the seat of the Crusader Christian king, who wasn't exactly a big fan of the Arabs. So there's a lot of questions about the story. However, modern scholars have found documentation in the Cairo Geniza that seems to corroborate that he probably was killed upon entry at some point soon after he landed in the land of Israel, in some way of martyrdom, right? Because he was called a martyr in several documents. So somehow he made it to Israel, but met the end of his life, right? Now, where he's buried, nobody really knows. There were some stories that he may have been buried in Tiberia, in Tiberias, and other places. So we don't really know. Now, his book, the Sefer Kuzari, right, which had a name which wasn't exactly a very glamorous name, In Defense of the Despised Faith, by the time it was translated by Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon 30 years later, he had already changed his name to Sefer Kuzari, which was, given the spirit of the time, a much more a popular name. It's a name people. Everyone, the Jews at the time were so proud of the Khazar king because he was a Jewish king. He chose Judaism. So that's the name by which the book became known, and that's the name which most people call it to this day. And if you see like the Korobkin, it says the Kuzari, and then in defense of the despised faith in small letters, because that was the original name. So Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi is remembered as a lover of Zion, a lover of the Jewish people, a person who instilled pride in the Jewish people at a time when we needed it most, and a person who was extremely well educated in the philosophy of his day, the science of his day. He was a physician, he was a poet, he was a master of the Hebrew language, and a person who really breathed life into Judaism at a time when we desperately needed it. He was a traditional scholar, and we know, especially from the Cairo Geniza, how well respected he was by the people, the Jewish population of the day. How honored he was, and how beloved he was. He was a beloved figure. The letters that we find show he was just somebody that everyone looked up to, and the people of Cairo begged him to just stay and be their leader, but he chose otherwise. He chose to fulfill his life's dream of going to the Holy Land. Now, this is his life, and this is the book that we're going to read, and the book that he wrote, the Kuzari, became one of the most important books influencing the Jewish people in our attachment to Jewish peoplehood and to Jewish religion and to the Holy Land. And for hundreds and hundreds of years and centuries to this day, people study this book, and it instills us with pride. It instills us with pride in who we are, and pride in our unique belief system, our unique religion, our culture, and so on. And it became a basis upon which most movements that came out of Judaism later on, whether it's Hasidic movement or the Kabbalistic movement or even the anti-Hasidic movement. The Gaon of Vilna was famous, who was one of the anti-Hasidic movement, who was the beginner of even the Muslim movement, right? This was a very, very important book, and it was what most common folk would study if they wanted to know, what does Judaism teach? What is my philosophy? What do I believe in? What's my relationship with God? What's special about being a Jew? And so to this day, it has taken that very important place in our society. And we will find, as we go through, it, we'll see the difference between this and the very different approach to Judaism that we studied together the last few years when we studied Rambam, and how he approached the similar issues, but in an extremely radically different way. I see there's a hand up. I'll open to discussion for the next few minutes. We'll talk, and then next Wednesday, we'll actually open the book and begin it together, and it should be a lot of fun. But go ahead, Jeffrey, you had a question.
Okay, two questions, so I can go to sleep at night. Did Herzl read this, and what is the Lubavitch Rebbe's attitude towards the Kuzari?
You'd have to ask your favorite Chabad friend to exactly what the Lubavitch Rebbe's attitude towards this was, because I honestly don't know. I do know that Chabad honors and loves this book, right? So you can go, if you go into your local Chabad center with this book, and your Chabad rabbi will give you a thumbs up, right? That I can tell you, right? I don't know specifically what the Lubavitch Rebbe said, but I'm sure if you asked your favorite Chabad rabbi, he'll tell you, right? But it's not just almost every movement that builds itself on Jewish pride. I mean, if you talk about the religious Zionist movement in Israel today, right? The Kuzari is, and by the way, if Kuzari is the right way to pronounce it, I don't know if it's Kuzari. I honestly don't know. So just whatever, just take it for what it's worth. I'm saying Kuzari because it's the shortest, easiest version. But the religious Zionist movement is they study this like literally religiously. This is one of their foundational texts. And but it's not just that. The Hasidic movement studies it a lot. I mean, you find it's, and you'll see as we study it, you'll understand how this inspired all of that, like all of those movements that set our souls on fire. I remember he was a poet, right? He knew how to use words to instill spiritual fervor and excitement and pride and all of the kinds of things. And that's he was setting out to do that, and he did an incredibly masterful job at doing it. So as we go through it, we need to try to let ourselves get uplifted by that, you know. And we'll see. You know, the Rambam was very different, as you know, but this you'll see as we learn it. Okay, Yosef, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, somewhat as a response to that, a lot of the rabbis in Merkaz Rav of Rav Kook wrote commentaries and gave classes over the years, over the last 100 years, and they all, like you said, have cherished those ideas. But I think even more amazing, Rabbi Shalom Rosner gave tonight a class on the Parsha. He's been giving it for almost 17 years now. He was a classmate of mine in Shalvim, and he quoted both the Moreh Nevuchim and the Kuzari in his Parsha for So I'll send it to you, but it's just amazing because he wasn't talking about the differences. The Moreh Nevuchim was about the Beit HaMikdash, and the Kuzari was about Eretz Israel and stuff like that. So it is probably one of the most quoted books because it is so basic and thank you.
Yeah, and that's why we really need to study it. If you really want to understand Judaism, you know, this is crucial. This is very crucial. This is one of the books that's the bottom line. And I fully intend on, with every single one of you and whoever else you invite, if we stick with it the whole way through, I promise you, you're going to walk out at the end, when you look around you and you see the Judaism that's practiced, and you have discussions with your friends in shul or at wherever, meeting your friends, and you'll realize, oh, all this that we're talking about, it all comes from here, you know. And you'll realize how deeply he influenced the way we think as Jews. And it's not an exaggeration. You know, if you think I might be exaggerating, then stick with me and you'll see that I'm not. If anything, I'm understating it. But go ahead, Martin. Yes.
So does the book spend nearly as much time on the other three faiths as it does on Judaism?
Not as much time. The focus is, of course, on Judaism, but he does talk about the other three, which is, by the way, the other three, which is Islam, Christianity, and the philosopher. By the way, you can already sense the difference where he goes and the Rambam goes, right? Because Yehuda HaLevi puts the philosopher and Islam and the Christians as separate other paths that we can follow, and Judaism as the right path, right? Whereas the Rambam doesn't do that at all. The Rambam takes the philosopher, right, and incorporates it into Judaism. He even takes Islamic philosophy, as we saw studying the Moreh Nevuchim many times, and where he felt that it could teach us something, he used it in Judaism. He doesn't use much of Christianity at all because Rambam, as we saw, does not respect Christianity much at all. But had he seen some Christianity that he liked, he wouldn't have had necessarily a problem taking it. He rejected the whole. But so the Rambam didn't look at it as different streams, right? And we're going to take this path, and we're the other ones. The Rambam looked at it as. But remember that it's hard to say that Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi or Maimonides, who was a bigger philosopher, I have no idea, and that would be a silly thing to argue about. But they certainly they were both very educated in the philosophy, but both had a very different approach to how to incorporate that into our religious practice. Where Yehuda HaLevi viewed it as something different, as another approach, right? Rambam didn't view it that way at all. Rambam looked at it as let's take this truth and let's take this truth and let's take this truth, put it all together and find a path. But that's just right. We didn't even study the book yet, and I already showed you a contrast. But as we go through it, you'll see more and more and more. But through contrast, we also learn a lot. We try to find our souls. A little learn from here, a little learn from there. I see a hand up. Go ahead. Yes, Avril Weissman. Oh, I need to unmute you. If you're talking, we can't hear you. So hold on. I think you need to unmute yourself because everybody's muted. All right. Well, I'm sorry if there's someone else that has something to say while.
Yeah, so I think it's sort of interesting about the difference between their approach with Greek philosophy, Rambam and HaLevi, because that's sort of been a sticking point in Judaism for, I guess, centuries, hasn't it? I mean, there are Jews that really took on the Greek philosophy and thought that was really important to incorporate. And there were Jews that said we shouldn't do that. I mean, that's what Hanukkah's all about, right? I mean,
well, I mean, yeah,
so,
that conflict is definitely an ongoing conflict, which proceeds on today, and the different approaches are there, and we can pick and choose where we find our own souls going. But it's important to see the contrast. Yeah, absolutely, it's going on for centuries. But these two books in particular, at this particular time in history, um, show those two different approaches. But I just picked that as a little point. I promise we're going to go into this in more and more and more detail as we go through it.
yeah, I mean, you're right. That's a small point, but I just keyed on it because to me, I don't know if there's ever going to be a resolution for that, or there should be. It's an interesting thing that there's always been a difference of opinion about what Greek thought and Greek life is all about in terms of its relationship to Judaism. So I just mentioned.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Any other comments before we move on to the next one? And I promise. Go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask you what the book that you have chosen for the class is. Does it contain both Hebrew and English, or is it just English?
This one has the Korobkin one has Hebrew and English, but it's not going to be the exact same Hebrew that I'm going to read, because I'm pretty sure the Hebrew that he has is the Ibn Tibbon, the original, the first translation, the one that was used over the centuries. I'm pretty sure that's the case. If I'm wrong, somebody can correct me. I'll look at it again, but I'm 90% sure that's what he used. And the Hebrew that I'm using is a much more modern Hebrew translation that goes back to the original Arabic and retranslates it in a modern Hebrew.
This one, which is the one that I ordered on Amazon, it's all English in the first half, and then the Hebrew is in the last half. So it's hard to do a comparison.
Right. So this one I'm looking as Hebrew and English on the page. Okay. Either way, I'm aware that many of the people listening won't know the Hebrew that I read, so I'm going to translate it carefully, and so we'll all be able to follow along. Whichever book you have, if it's a different translation, that might even be better, because you may be able to chip in to put in a few points in the conversation, say that your translation might have a little nuanced difference, which might affect the way we understand things. So translations can be really interesting. But we're going to study, he gets right down to business, so we're going to get right into the excitement, just, straight off the bat. So there's a lot of fun to be had. And I'm really looking forward to this. And I hope next we'll get another cup. I don't know if there are pictures, representations and pictures of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi. But I don't think they have any relationship to what he actually looked like. But there's statues in various places in the world to him, a couple in Israel and other places. So we have a likeness if you want to put it on a mug in a few years. But I don't know if he was the coffee drinking type. He might have been something else. But it's worthwhile if you have a chance. Just Google Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi poems, and you'll see some of the poems that he wrote, and you'll see some of the secular poems you'll be blown away by the kinds of things that he wrote, the passion, and I mean, he writes about things among the religious poems, which are incredibly powerful, and his Hebrew language is just masterful beyond almost anyone ever, like probably one of the best writers in Hebrew ever. But he also writes about, mundane things, a beautiful woman and her cover me with kisses, like passionate things, and about beautiful nature, and things that when you write it, you say, wow, this was a man, his soul was on fire. This guy's soul was on fire, and he knew how to kindle yours. you know and he's a very remarkable person, and we'll learn about him. Okay, we'll learn what he had to say. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining, and God willing, next week we'll do the same thing, same time, Wednesday, and we'll start the book.
Thank you.
All right, take
Thanks,
care.
Tom.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Saul.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks all.